Founded by my grandfather, Benjamin Bass, in 1927 in just a block over in an area that was known as Book Row. It ran along 4th Avenue and spanned from Astor Place to Union Square. At its height, it housed 48 bookstores. In the 90 years since then, all but one of those stores has shuttered, leaving Strand to be passed down to my father, who recently died, and now to me, always to be kept in the Bass family. Tonight, we're super excited to be hosting Stacey Abrams, who is one of the most dynamic leaders in the country. Having played a key role in the Georgia state legislature, she is making history as the first African-American woman to run for governor in the state of Georgia. My husband, U.S. Senator Ron Wyden, says this will be the first of the most important elections in 2018, as Stacey has been a leader in improving women's health care, Medicaid, tax fairness, and other issues that are our priorities. In addition, Stacey is an accomplished writer, having authored numerous articles on public policy and nonprofit organizations. In a secret life, Stacey has written several award-winning romance and suspense novels under her pen name, Selena Montgomery. Joining her in conversation tonight is author and TV podcast host Ashley C. Ford, who hosts the Brooklyn-based news and cultural show 112 BK. And she has written and guest edited for places like Elle, BuzzFeed, Teen Vogue, and New York Magazine. And she was named one of Forbes magazine's 30 under 30 in the media. Please join me in welcoming Stacey and Ashley to the Strand.
Selena's going to join us today. Selena Montgomery is going to join us today, but first Stacey's here. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you to the Strand. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Libby, for reaching out. This is so much fun for me. I actually got to interview Stacey for a little newsletter called Lenny Letter a couple years ago, and it was one of the first interviews I did where I walked away being like, I wish I lived in Georgia so I could vote for him. To be perfectly honest. It's actually the only time I've ever wished I lived in Georgia, but now that I've been to Georgia, gotta tell you, I'm still interested.
Y'all come back now, you hear?
I will come through. Stacey, after reading this book, one of the things that was extremely evident about you as a woman is that your life has sort of been about pushing boundaries and also about making space for yourself in places where others haven't necessarily made space for you. But ultimately, the number one thing I would say about you is that you are always looking for ways to be useful and to be helpful to other people. So I have to ask, why politics?
So I grew up before I do that, I am Southern, so I have to say thank you to Nancy for hosting us. Thank you to the Strand team, and thank you, Ashley. And I have to thank the people who actually made my book come to life. Linda, who agreed to represent me, Libby, who agreed to publish me, and Carolyn, who's told everyone else about me. So thank you. That done, thank you for the question. Yeah, look, I grew up in a family that was working poor. My mom is one of 7 kids. She is the only one of her 7 siblings to finish high school. The only one to go to college, certainly the only one to go to graduate school. My dad is one of 5. He is the first man in his family to go to college. They did everything you're told to do academically for success, and they found themselves moving out of abject poverty into working poverty. They moved back to Mississippi, and that's where I grew up. And my parents had every reason to be bitter, to be angry that racism and sexism still haunted their lives and did not allow them to have the kind of agency they should have had with their education. But instead, they were very down to earth and very committed to making certain that the six of us, because my parents are also very prolific, that the six of us really grew up believing our potential was boundless. They had 3 rules for us: go to church, go to school, take care of each other. Faith was important because they wanted us to understand that economic poverty did not create moral poverty. And they wanted us to leverage the faith that we had as a moral framework to really understand the world around us. But they also told us, you don't use your faith to discriminate. You don't use your faith to justify bigotry and hatred. That you are supposed to protect others. You never hurt them with what you believe. They told us to go to school because even though it hadn't gotten them as far as they hoped it would, it had gotten them further than anyone in their families. But the last one, and this goes to why politics, was that my mom and dad told us that you serve, which we found a bit absurd because we're like, you guys do know we're poor, right? But the lights might be cut off, we might be without running water, and my parents would still wake us up on Saturdays and we'd go volunteer at soup kitchens and homeless shelters. We just called it Saturday, but it was like service every single Saturday. And it upset me because, not because I didn't want to serve, but because it looked to me that my parents, these 2 amazing people with their 6 children, were trying to drain the ocean of need. And I didn't know how it would ever happen. And so I would talk to my parents, like, shouldn't there be someone or something that makes this easier, that tackles poverty, that addresses need, that addresses want? And they said that's called government. That's really how humans have organized themselves, so we would work together to make life better for others. The problem being that sometimes government wasn't doing what it was supposed to. And so I became very annoyed with government and decided I wanted to meet it. And very early on realized that my posture for service was not going to be what my parents did. My parents eventually became Methodist ministers. But where I had the greatest utility was that I was good at government. I was good at understanding public policy. I was effective at explaining it. And the more I did it, the more I realized I could get other people to sometimes come along with me to get things done. And so this is what I do.
And you do it very well, might I say. Now this book is sort of posited as a manual for people who live and or are pushed outside the margins of mainstream society, who would like to be helpful in bringing those perspectives, obviously, into mainstream society, but also just people who have good ideas, who can come from anywhere. So what makes you an outsider?
So there's a normative description of power. When we think about power, it's typically it's typically a straight white man of some means, but really any means. The reality is that when that is the notion of power, everything else is molded to try to reflect that. And if you lived during the 80s, even our clothes as women were designed to reflect that notion of what power should look like.
Well, I remember the shoulder pads.
Exactly. No, but I mean, and if you remember the ties, they were very awkward. And so the notion of an outsider to me is anyone who does not meet that normative standard because of gender, because of race, because of sexual orientation, because of economy, because of class, because of faith. Anything that pushes you outside of this normative Christian white male standard can sometimes mean that you are not presumed to be a natural inheritor or wielder of power. But we all know that if you want things to be accomplished, power is critical. And that's really all it's about. It's your ability to shape the world around you, to make it what you need it to be. That's what power does. And the absence of it means that you're often the victim of someone else's power. And so for me, as a black woman from the South who grew up poor, I check most of the boxes. The boxes I don't check, I'm sure I'll get around to. But the larger narrative for me is that I've still been able to wield it and access power. It's been through sneaky means and through guerrilla tactics and through trying to find ways, often when people didn't see that power existed there, trying to sort of, snatch a little bit of it for myself and then spread as much of it around as I could. but that fundamentally what makes us outsiders is that we are not presumed to be the wielders of power.
Well, I like that description, but I have to ask, when you talk about power and the powerful, and you've mentioned growing up poor and class, I wonder, what is it do you think specifically, and I want to ask you about this because I don't know if you guys know, but Stacey wrote this amazing commentary on being in debt and how being in debt should not sort of knock her out of competition for governor. And I read it, and I swear to God, it felt like I could have been reading about myself, to be perfectly honest, because I know what it's like when you might personally experience the opportunity for class transition, but when you have familial attachments to people who are not in the same position, what do? Do you say, well, I'm middle class, I don't know what y'all doing? You know what I mean? No, you don't. You help your people, you help your family, which makes me want to ask you, why do you think it is that we have moralized poverty in this country?
I was thinking about this earlier today. If you are wealthy and you seek debt, that is seen as innovation. It is seen as something noble because you are creating. If you remember during the 2012 election, the job creator notion of Mitt Romney, which grates on my nerves, that there's some largesse that's being created by the creation of wealth. People don't, if you own a business, you are not in business to create jobs. You're in business to create money. And the best way to get the money is to hire people to help you do it, and those are called jobs. But when you're wealthy, there is some sense of that you are doing something noble for society by, allowing the rest of us to see your wealth. If you're poor, it's that you are irresponsible. And we see this playing out even today when Ben Carson announced that he intends to triple the cost of housing. And his argument is that if it was more expensive, poor people would work harder and make better wages. We've moralized poverty to justify our meanness. And I mean our meaning them, because I don't have any. But it is. One of the ways you maintain class distinctions, you maintain power, is by othering those who you do not want to disturb your space. And one of the most effective means it began with the Horatio Alger narrative, which has never been true and never been possible. We've made this we've iconized this notion that you come from nothing and become great, and then we mythologize the beginning and we celebrate the end and we ignore all the pieces in between. It's easier to manage a people and to control a society when everyone believes that they are less than. Because when you are to the manner born and you think that you should have access, then you start demanding things. You start demanding better pay. You start demanding access to healthcare. You start demanding all of these other things, and that means somebody's money is not going to go into their pockets. And so creating a moral justification for people remaining trapped by debt and poverty is a great way to continue to manage power and keep it to yourself.
All right, well, that one made me kind of mad, but you're right. It was correct, just also infuriating. Talk to me about Georgia specifically. Why run in Georgia? Why serve Georgia? What is so unique about Georgia that you've decided that it's not just the place you want to make your home, it's the place you want to serve?
So my parents, as I said, my mom was a librarian, my dad was a shipyard worker. They were working poor, but apparently not poor enough, because then they decided to become ministers. So when I was 15, they decided to become United Methodist ministers. They were both admitted to Emory University. And so we packed up and moved from Mississippi to Atlanta to DeKalb County, where I met my friend Candace, who was my first friend in high school when I moved to the new school. Mom and Dad made certain that we got to know Atlanta because we served there too. We volunteered everywhere. And what I loved about Atlanta when we moved here, first of all, there was more than one mall, which is a big deal when you're 15, because I'm telling you, there was one mall that we shared with the next city, and we were the two largest cities in the state in Mississippi. So, dude, there were malls everywhere in Georgia. It was amazing. That was transformative. Number two, I watch a lot of television. And where I grew up in Gulfport, we had ABC. If you did not have cable, you only saw ABC and PBS. My parents could not afford cable. When I got to Atlanta and I realized you got 3 channels for nothing, that was amazing. And then there was Fox. I'm like, dude, this is like a gold mine. So that's why I loved it when I got there. I graduated from high school. I went to Spelman College. Spelman was a transformative opportunity for me. Left for graduate school, went to Texas. I loved Austin, but I was in Texas the year that George Bush decided he would start to, when he became governor. I'm on C-SPAN. And then I went to Yale, and I loved that school, but I do not like being cold. And I grew up on the beach, so Yale made no sense. Connecticut, it befuddles me that it's that cold all the time. And so when I thought about where I would set down my roots, I wanted to be a tax attorney. I wanted to stay in the South. And I really wanted, at the time, I wanted to be mayor of Atlanta because it was a city that I thought could, through the right leadership, tackle poverty at its core. And for me, my pathway was going to go back to Atlanta. I went back. I love Atlanta. I love Georgia. But I realized I didn't want the job of mayor, that the scale of what I think we need to change in the state has to happen from the governor's mansion. That if you want to address issues of poverty and inequality, if you want to deal with the high incarceration rate, if you want to address the lack of access to health care, if you want people to be able to prosper and thrive, and you want people to be able to take care of themselves and their families, then the governorship is the way to do that, because Georgia has a very powerful governor. My affinity for Georgia is this. I love my home state of Mississippi, but Georgia's my adopted home. And when Georgia does something transformative, it will reverberate to all the other states in the Deep South. And it is only in Georgia, I believe, that I will have the opportunity to shape the kind of future I want to see for the Deep South, because that will always be my home.
Girl, how dare you? Let's move to Georgia, babe. I'm wondering, as someone who has sincerely, dedicated their life to service, who keeps you sane? Who serves you?
My family is first and foremost. I have 5 extraordinary brothers and sisters. I'm number 2, so I have an older sister who's an anthropologist and is just so thoughtful about the world. My sister Leslie, so Andrea is my oldest sister. My sister Leslie is a federal judge in Georgia. She's a real lawyer. I just play one on TV. But Leslie's sense of moral compass is unshakable. My brother Richard is the best dad I've ever seen, and when we were growing up, he was my responsibility. We were each assigned a child, and my job was to make sure. Richard, to this day, he sent me a text a while back about his daughter Ryan waking him up at the crack of dawn, and he was like, and she has not stopped talking. I said, good for you. It's called karma. Because I remember you. I'm like, what, Richard? It's Richard. There's no light outside. Stacey. Richard, there's no light outside. Anyway, so yes, I wish upon him his daughter Ryan, who's adorable and wonderful. But he's just a good person. My brother Walter he's had some challenges. I talk about him on the campaign trail. Walter is a brilliant man, but he's suffered from drug addiction and from mental illness, and he's still struggling to put his life together. But a few weeks ago, he sent me a text message. He just recently was released from prison again, and he said, I can't come to Georgia for obvious reasons, because he's on parole, or probation. And he said, I can't come to Georgia, but how can I help your campaign? And when I texted him back, I was in the midst of going to an event, and I just sent him a quick text, and I wasn't trying to be terse, but he responded and he said, I hope you know I won't disappoint you again. I really just want to help. He's in the midst of one of the most difficult transitions he will ever face. He's trying to stay sober, he's trying to stay healthy, he's re-entering society for a second time, having stumbled the last time this happened, and the only thing he's thinking about is how can he help me with my dream. Like that grounds you. That keeps you committed to what has to be done. And then my youngest sister, Janine, is an evolutionary biologist who is just sweet and funny and takes the world seriously, but not herself. And so that combination just reminds me that nobody thinks I'm that important. Like, they are not impressed at all. Like, they're like, yeah, yay, Stacey. And then my parents. My parents are the most extraordinary people I've ever known. They are good and moral and kind and flawed, and they know that that is not a contradiction. And they raised us to understand that we could be our whole selves. And that means I can be a romance novelist, tax attorney, governor, who writes, memoirs on the side.
Yes. Yes. Look at you. Yes. Absolutely. Sorry, I know that y'all are excited. I'm more excited. Next to her, hearing all of this, I'm very, very excited. It's interesting that you bring up your brother and his former incarceration. I think you might know this. I'm the daughter of, and my father was in prison for 30 years, and I'm only 31. And I have a relationship, with my dad, and that was hard forged. It took a lot of work on both of our parts to be able to stay connected. It makes me wonder, especially in a state like Georgia, do you have thoughts on incarceration rates and the use of private prisons?
Absolutely. So Georgia in 2013 had the 4th highest incarceration rate in the nation. We're only the 8th largest state. And one of the reasons for that incarceration rate was that in the 80s, when California was doing 3 strikes or out, Georgia thought that was too many and did 2 strikes. And so we ballooned the incarceration rate. Nathan Deal, who's the Republican governor of Georgia, the most extraordinary thing he has done is that he has made it his mission to reduce that incarceration rate. And I've been privileged as the minority leader to work beside him on this issue. And so he appointed me to several of the commissions that really addressed issues. And so I was able to tackle juvenile justice reform, occupational licenses in Georgia. If you were a felon, you couldn't get an occupational license. So you're in jail, you're in prison, they teach you a skill, but you get out of prison and it's illegal for you to use that trade, which then leads to recidivism. We've been able to tackle private probation in Georgia. I pushed back against legislation that was moving with a Republican colleague of mine, and we were able to force a narrative and a conversation about private probation. Private prisons are wrong. You cannot privatize justice. And to create a profit motive for incarceration is fundamentally morally offensive, and it is not sustainable. But we also have to think about the other pieces. Cash bail, which is the national conversation that we're having. It's thinking about issues like private probation. And in Georgia, there's a double-edged sword because we're using private probation to help with accountability courts, which are basically those courts that divert you from going to jail. But the way they monitor, because we've depopulated state government so much, there aren't enough people on staff from most counties to actually manage the probation rates that they need to keep people out of jail, and so we use private probation. And so we have to find a way to leverage the good without consuming the bad. But writ large, criminal justice reform is one of my top priorities. We incarcerate people because we are mad at them. And we incarcerate them because we are too cheap and too mean to take care of them. If my brother had had access to health care when we were growing up, my parents didn't have health insurance. When he started presenting, because we believe his bipolar disorder started presenting when he was a teenager, my parents didn't have the language to talk about mental health issues. And Walter did what so many young people do. He started self-medicating. And for 20 years, that escalated until it became a heroin addiction. Health insurance could have saved my brother's life. And we put too many people in jail because they are sick and because we are too cheap to pay for it. And I say we, meaning they, because it's their fault. I've been trying to fix it. My campaign team gets on me for personalizing it. But I take it personally. As someone who's served in the legislature, I take it very personally that I haven't been able to remedy this. And that's why I'm running for governor, because it is my problem to solve. It is our problem to solve. And we have permitted this to exist, either through electing the wrong people or not electing people or not talking about these issues. And as much as I'm proud to have talked about my debt, I'm even more excited to talk about my brother, because he is emblematic of what we need to be doing if we want our society to be what it should be. And if we want real power, it's addressing those issues.
Hashtag she's running. So, post late 2016, we've seen a blooming interest in women running for office. A good friend of mine has a website called Get Her Elected, like Lily Herman does that, and there's so many things. There's Emily's List, like so many, and Emily's List was way before that. I know that was before 2016. But there's been a concerted effort to get more women running in this race. I have to ask what advice you would have for these women, because a lot of them are going to be newbies, and you are, not new to this. You're true to this.
So the first is know why you're running. Anger is a good motivator, but it is not a good strategy. And being angry means that you're going to still be in this job when you're not angry anymore. And so you might want to know what you plan to do when you get there. Number two, be clear that you're running for the right job. If you're angry about poor education, do not run for sheriff. And if you are upset about the zoning in your community, don't run for state legislature. Make certain you match your mission to the job. Because sometimes we are so angry and not just angry, sometimes we're so energized and so ready that we run for anything. Now, there is a group called Run for Something. Run for something is good. Run for anything is not good. Because when you run for anything, then you find yourself frustrated because you can't accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. The third is do not be afraid of raising money. For women in particular, fundraising, and I talk about this in the book, fundraising is hard because for some reason we think that it somehow diminishes us or embarrasses us to ask for money. I don't get to keep a dime of what I raise, and I've raised a whole lot of money. And all of that money is in service of the vision of what we can do together. It's in service of my ability to be effective. It does not go to me. And so we have to get past this personalization of fundraising. You don't get to keep it, so you might as well not be ashamed of asking for it. And then the last one is know what you believe, and this is kind of encompassed. Know what you believe, know why you believe it, and don't believe too much. Ideologues are not effective in government. Ted Cruz. I like Tom. Exactly. But someone like a Ted Cruz, and there are someone on my side of the aisle too. But when your ideology prevents you from having a working relationship with people who do not share it, you cease to be as effective as you could be. And for the communities we represent, it is a luxury to be that rigid. It is a luxury that we cannot afford, because if people were going to do what we wanted, they would have done it before. I've taken some heat from my opponent in my primary because I've worked with Republicans, and she has castigated me and said, well, you compromise your principles. Like, no, my principle is taking care of people. My principle is that we have to do what we can to serve as many people as we can and to do the least amount of harm possible. That is the principle in which I stand. And the challenge of being an ideologue is that you lose sight of the principle and you lose sight of your purpose because you're so ready to win. And ideology doesn't feed anybody. Ideology doesn't save a community. Ideology doesn't end in mass incarceration. What ends those things is your ability to work with everyone to get things done. And I'm not saying compromise who you are, because there are some hard lines I will not cross. There is no compromise available on reproductive choice. There is no compromise available on treating the poor with dignity. But for a lot of places, there are ways we can have a different conversation than we're often willing to. Because when you're ideologically driven and that is the only metric you use, you miss multiple opportunities to advance the goal and to take care of real people.
You know, one of the things that I feel like I keep thinking in this political season, and even as I was reading your book, I kept thinking over and over, this is just so reasonable. Like, it's reasonable. Like, as I'm reading the book, like, it's just, and for me, and I think for a lot of people, reasonable is a breath of fresh air. Just someone who will say, well, this is what we know, and this is what we're doing, and these are our thoughts on that. It's like, wow, that's amazing, just having that. So how do we get more of that into the political arena right now? How do we invite more reasonable conversation, some civility at the very least?
We have to celebrate it. Because right now what we celebrate are the histrionics at either end. What we celebrate are the hard lines that sound exactly like what we want to be true. We do not celebrate moderation. And I'm not talking about moderation of belief or moderation of principle. I am a progressive, and there are some who are saying I'm too liberal. And what I push back on is I want you to look at one thing I've done in this campaign that is contrary to what I did for the 7 years I was leader and the 11 years I was in the legislature. There is no difference. It's just when I was doing it, I was always so reasonable about how I did it, they forgot to pay attention to what I was doing. I've been doing the same thing the whole time. And I think that's the challenge, that we assume that stridency is the same as effectiveness. That you have to be angry or loud or so intense as to that carries more weight than ideas. One of my favorite examples is that, climate change is real, just in case you didn't know. And in Georgia, there were bills that were being pushed by the Chamber of Commerce, by the governor's office, by a number of folks to weaken some stream buffer rules, which sounds really sexy. And they should have been able to move the bills because they controlled the governor's office, they controlled the House and the Senate. I went to the Tea Party, and I said, I need you to help me block this bill. Not because they believed in climate change. I didn't try to convince them that climate change was real. I convinced them property values are real. Because if these streams were eroded, then their property values would go down. Stridency says, you only can work with me if you agree with me on why you're doing it. Reasonable says, let me find out why you care about this thing and get you to do what I need you to do anyway. And we blocked that bill for 3 years. Not because I ever convinced a single one of them that climate change was happening, but because I met them where they are and worked with them to do the things that need to be done. Reasonableness is not about giving away where you are, it's about figuring out where they are and how do you try to match your needs to one another. But to the extent everything has to be about your conversion to my belief, we're both going to be really unhappy for a really long time.
That's what we call effective. Somebody who can actually get things done. I like that. I like that about you personally. So as someone who gets things done, one of the things that keeps boggling my mind is how you get so much done. Because yes, you're running for governor, but even the minority leader of the Georgia House. Also, I think we all heard earlier, a romance and suspense novelist. So, talk to me about this a little bit, because I'm trying to do a few things at the same time as well. Not going as well as it seemed to go for you, but, moving forward.
You're 31, you got time.
I do have some time. Hopefully. Nothing's promised. I'm just kidding. We're not going to make this dark.
Come back to the light.
But I'm going to come back into the light to basically ask you, with romance novels, suspense, is that just a personal pleasure hobby that you were like, listen, this is something that I want to do, and I'm going to do it?
So, in Chapter 8 of Minority Leader, I talk about work-life Jenga. Yes. Because there is no such thing as work-life balance. It is a lie that has been predicated upon us all, and we need to reject it with the white, hot fury of 1,000 suns. It does not exist. Jenga, however, is a really difficult game where you are hoping that the whole thing doesn't just collapse in on itself. And for me, writing has always been part of how I keep myself sane and happy, and I've written for as long as I can remember. when I wrote my first novel, it was during law school because I didn't feel like going to class. And I wanted to, my ex-boyfriend at the time, he was a chemical physicist, and I was like one of 4 people who read his dissertation. And he discovered this chemical called microzeolites, or he figured something out. And I was like, ooh, this is cool. You can do this with it and this with it. And I was telling him, and he was like, no, you can't. That's not what it is. I'm like, this is why we broke up, because you have no imagination. And so I was like, I was really taken by the idea. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write a spy novel. But this is the late 90s. And publishers at the time were not publishing spy novels by or about women. And I had the audacity to actually want my main character to be a woman of color, to be African American. And that certainly wasn't going to happen. And so I talked to friends who were in the publishing industry, and they were like, that's not going to work. And I thought, I know I've read espionage novels with women. I know I've done that. And I realized they were romance novels. Plus, I had a deep and abiding fascination with Robert Scorpio and Anna Scorpio on General Hospital. So that was also part of it. And Luca Mora. And so I decided to write my spy novel as a romance novel. I killed the same number of people, but whoever got to survive fell in love. And so that was the beginning of Rules of Engagement. And I sent it to a publisher. She bought it, and she was in the market for, because it was at the end of '99, heading into the 2000s. It was at the real beginning of women of color writing romantic suspense. Which is romance where you have more action adventure than not. And she really liked the books, and so she said, well, do you want to write a couple more? And she bought it, and I was, I had student loan debt, so I'm like, sure. I also did not have an agent, so I took way too little money for it. And then another publisher read one of my books and called and said, how do you feel about a serial killer romance novel? Well, she said, do you want to write something dark? And I was like, I have a serial killer romance novel. She was like, okay, let's see if we can make this work. And yes, I killed a lot of people in that one too. And then I work out a lot of my aggression through my work. And then HarperCollins, actually someone whose girlfriend gave him my book to read, he called me and said, I'm sure you don't have an agent because your writing is not traditional romance. And I said, you are absolutely right. And he offered to represent me, and he got me to HarperCollins, and that's how I became a romantic suspense novelist who wrote 8 books. Available on Amazon.com, and more importantly, in the Strand, and independent bookstores across the country.
I actually have one more question for you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions, if that's all right with you guys. It really doesn't matter if it's okay with you. That's okay. But my last question for you is, I feel like you write a book like this, and you do the work that you do, and you run for governor, and it makes somebody like me who has no political desires think more about how I can personally support the people who I see doing the kind of work that I think is important. I don't live in Georgia. I can't vote for you. I can use the hashtag Team Abrams. That seems like it might be at least a little helpful. But in general, how do people like us, who don't necessarily see ourselves going into politics, help people like you with what you're doing?
I'm going to back out from that question a little bit and say, part of the reason for the book is that not everyone needs to be in politics. I as we've discussed, I am a romance novelist, tax attorney, entrepreneur, nonprofit leader, politician. We can all find space in our world to be leaders. We can all find spaces in our world to be powerful. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was that I didn't want people to think that power was reserved to those who had certain jobs or stood in certain spaces, and that their narrative trumps our own. Because sometimes you are powerful because you convince the PTA to do something that it doesn't want to do. You get your zoning board to stop being mean. You convince a politician to do what she should do without threatening, too much hairy-carry. We all are possessed of power that we don't recognize because we've been told it's not really power. And for me, the act of running for governor is a moment of seizing that power. Because there has never been an elected black woman as governor in the history of America, there is something very threatening about my approach. And there's something threatening about my possibility. But there's also something very powerful about the fact that I think I should, and despite the people who keep telling me no, because I have debt, because I don't look the way they expected me to look, that this is my time and this is my opportunity. What you can do to help, if you want to help me specifically, is go to StaceyAbrams.com and sign up to. You can volunteer. You can talk about messaging. You can help. But for everyone who wants to see change, figure out where the change needs to happen, and if it's not you creating it, help the person you know is doing it. And if no one's doing it, then that's your cue. That's your call. We have too many challenges that go unanswered because we have been convinced that we don't have the capacity to solve the problem. And in the very first chapter of the book, I talk about ambition, daring to dream. Ambition is hard. It is awkward. It is sometimes numbing. And we are taught from an early age to edit our ambitions, to fit into what people perceive we are capable of. I want every person to think that their ambitions are wildly achievable and that they should be confined only by time and space and nothing else. But then you have to organize yourself to make it so. And so if it's a politician that you want to help, if it is a leader that you see who needs a little more support, or if it is your leadership that needs to burgeon and grow, then the beginning is admitting that you have the right to do so, that you have the agency and the authority to be powerful, and that no one has the right to tell you no.
Thank you, Stacey.
That felt personal.
She was looking out at y'all, but I felt like she was talking to me.
Ashley, you have the right to be powerful.
Thanks, girl. So, I'm going to take questions. I only have one rule when I take questions from people, which is that you have to ask a question. I know you might have some really wonderful, beautiful thoughts about Stacey, and I hope you can share them with her when she's signing books. But until then, just ask a question. Is that cool? Can we all agree on that? Yes. Fantastic. Now, who has a question? Yes.
Stacey,
I can bring your microphone.
okay.
Peter's got you.
Can you talk a little bit? My question is, there is a rise of overt racism in America right now. What's your response to that?
Remove Trump from office. That's a glib answer, but part of why we see the unabashed rise of xenophobia and racism is that we have a person who occupies the White House who has said it's okay. And when you give permission for the worst instincts of people to be lived out in public, then they will do so, especially when there are no consequences. My worry is that we have become numbed to this rise of supremacy that is grounded in race and grounded in a false notion of who should be in charge and who's right to be here. And that extends to how we're treating immigrants, how we treat the Muslim community, how we treat people of color, what happens to black people when they go outside or stand in the backyard. That all of these are of a piece, or when you go to Starbucks or Waffle House or outside. And I mean it in this way. We have to continue to demand better, not only of our leaders, but of our communities. The hue and cry that went up because of what happened in Starbucks was important, but it has to be sustained. And it has to look at the young kid who is afraid to go to school because he's afraid that his mother will be taken away from him because she's undocumented. It's when we walk away from someone who is being mildly mocked because they're different. We are personally responsible, each of us, for addressing the challenge of racism and of bigotry. And it is only when we start to think that it is acceptable or when we think it is impenetrable that it wins. It is a terrible thing that Trump allows it to be done in his name. But the thing is, it's a terrible thing that we allowed him to become president because we didn't vote. And it's a terrible thing that when President Obama was being chastised for simply mentioning that he thought that Trayvon Martin could have been his child, that when he was lambasted, that the rest of us stood in silence and didn't push back. And we have to remember, this is the legacy of America. But it's also, I don't believe it's permanent. Race will always be a marker. We use race to tell ourselves stories about who we are. We use gender to do the same thing. Our opportunity is to make sure that the stories we tell are better stories, and that the responsibilities that we attribute to those who have power are actually true and that they're held accountable to them. Anybody else?
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Tom Steyer, and you mentioned the, Trump needs to go thing, and I followed his tour, and unfortunately I don't think he's coming to New York, but he was in Atlanta. Did you go, and do you think his approach is better than like the established Democrats in Washington who are just kind of like letting this happen?
So I am a huge fan of Mr. Steyer, and I wasn't able to make it to the event. I was campaigning, so I didn't make it. But here's what I would say. I think impeachment is absolutely a lever we need to look at. But I think we create these false dichotomies, particularly within the Democratic Party, where it's X or Y. We don't accept that if you put the letters together, you can spell words and stuff. And so we don't have to pick one thing to make things so. I strongly support the idea that if President Trump if he's committed high crimes and misdemeanors, he should face impeachment. But we also know that the reality of American politics is that until you change Congress, there is no one who's going to act on that. And so my focus is, how do we change the composition of our leadership so that it actually values American values? And that's what's not happening right now. And that would be my mission, to make certain that Tom Steyer's investment in this conversation is lived out in the midterm elections, so that we can actually take action if it is demonstrated that this is something we need to do.
And another one back here while I got the mic, and then I'll wrap her.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm a Georgia voter, actually. Recently moved to New York, so really glad that you're here. So I wanted to ask a question about, I know you touched earlier on like working across the aisle, and you noticed the thing with Lieutenant Governor Cable and Delta and that whole shenanigan. Like, do you think there's a different territory when you're in a, like as a governor, would you maybe have a more difficult time working across the aisle? Like, would you be held more, I guess, to an ideological, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, the reality is we allow ourselves to be pushed into spaces depending on what we want. And one of the reasons you see people take hardline positions or take ideological positions, or sometimes just take uncompromising positions, is that they want to stay in power. They want to stay in their job. My responsibility is to never want the job more than I want to do the work. I want to do the work of being governor. And if working across the aisle accomplishes that, then that is what I do. The job is the important piece. The title is great, but a title that accomplishes nothing is a waste of time. And so what I try to do every single day is remind myself of what I'm trying to get done and why. And that means that sometimes you work with your friends, sometimes you have to work against your friends, sometimes you have to work with your worst enemy, and sometimes you fight your enemy, but you never lose sight of why you're doing this. And part of what happens with power is seductive. It is nice to have when there are fewer consequences for your actions than there were before. And that's why I also try really hard to never enjoy it. I mean, and not that I'm a churlish person who's unhappy with my life. No. What I mean is, there are perks that are offered that sometimes you just have to say no, not because you don't want it, but because you know if you take it, it's a slippery slope. And I try my best to make certain that what I do and what I accept and how I behave is something I'm always comfortable with when I get the question, not tomorrow, but the question 5 years from now. Do I have to apologize or explain what I've done? I have to make tough decisions. But more importantly, I believe I always have to stand by those decisions. So I'm very methodical. As you will discover, I mean, look, I've had a spreadsheet that has been helping me plan my life for 20 years. So I'm very goal-oriented as well. But that methodical behavior helps me. You can't avoid challenges, but you can avoid compromising who you are trying to avoid consequences, and that's often what we see happen.
As someone who's worked in government, I've been told you have to have uncommon patience.
Oh God, yes.
And you know, we also, I think, are animated by the fierce urgency of now. And so I wonder how you think of pace and impact. How do you hold those two truths and measure success for yourself and then move it forward?
So I served in the legislature for 11 years. The first time I passed a bill was 2016. So I'd been there for almost 9 years before I did. Now, during that time, I co-sponsored legislation. I helped other people pass their bills. I found and actually wrote legislation that I gave to other people to carry. Part of that was what I thought my responsibility as leader was, which is that you should cultivate new leadership and build their capacity. Part of it was that I noticed when I got to the legislature that if you wanted a bill to pass, you then became susceptible to people trying to hold you hostage. So to Sarah's question, the challenge was that if you showed someone you wanted something, then they were going to use that desire of yours to force you to vote for something you didn't want. And I realized early on that of the things I wanted to see done, that I was okay if someone else got the credit for it as long as the work got done. It was only on the issue of kinship care, grandparents and others raising children who are not their own. That's personal to me. My parents were raising my brother's child, and they've had her since she was 5 days old. And as a lawyer, I helped my parents navigate the Family and Children's Services Network in Mississippi, and I realized if it took me and my sister Leslie, who also went to Yale Law School, it took 2 Yale-educated lawyers to help my parents. Imagine what was happening to families in Georgia who didn't have access to our skills and our training. And for me, the patience piece is you have to be patient with knowing that your turn will come and that your attention will come if it's warranted, but it shouldn't impede your willingness to do the work anyway. And I'm good. I've in this campaign, there has been an accusation that I was ineffective because I didn't put my name on every bill that passed. I'm okay with that because I knew that when there was a moment that I needed to put my name on it, I could. And when I put my name on these bills, Republicans helped me get it through because they knew that for me this was so important. And I did the work of cultivating with people with whom I staunchly disagree. I talked to them about the issue. We did what's called a study committee. We traveled the state, and I went to places where they needed to be so they could see why it mattered. And it's the patience of knowing that if you take the time to build the story and build the narrative and build the understanding, you can get what you need. And that is hard, and it's a cultivated sensibility. But it goes back to wanting this question, do you want the title or do you want to do the work? And for me, it's about getting the work done.
Stacey, you're 6 months into your election. Can you tell us how the race is going and what your opponent is like and what the numbers are?
So actually, I've been running since June 3rd, 2017. It has been a long time. But it takes a long time in Georgia because Democrats have not won elections statewide in 15 years. And part of the challenge has been that there has not been investment in building infrastructure. But there's also a difference of strategy, and this is one of the key differences between myself and my opponent. We share the same first name. We're both named Stacey. My last name is first on the ballot, and that's what anybody should pay attention to, Abrams, that's it. But we differ in a few ways. One is strategy. My belief is that we cannot win elections as Democrats by trying to convince Republicans that they didn't mean to be Republicans. To put it in religious terms, it is like trying to convince an atheist that they really meant to be a Catholic. I believe you just get Baptists to go to church. People who already share your beliefs but haven't done anything about it. And so my approach is to find those voters who have gone untouched. And that's people of color, it's rural communities, it's poor communities, it's millennials. It's going to communities that have often been taken for granted or simply ignored. Because I believe that they too have the capacity to vote and the willingness to vote, but they have to have something to vote for. The reason there's a default in the Southern Democratic Party in particular going after Republicans is that the people that are often courted, they voted, they just never voted for us. And we keep like crossing our fingers like, yeah, he broke up with me, but this time he'll come back. No, he's gone. He's dating someone else. They are happily married. They've built a house, they've got cars, they've got pets. It's done, not coming back. And so my approach is to say that our responsibility is to actually build real voters from these communities so that it's not just about me winning an election. If I win and in the following year nothing else happens, then I have not done my job. The numbers currently are in my favor. The last two public polls have had me up by 17 and 18 points. But half of the state of Georgia is unaware that they haven't decided. So some of that is that they're not aware there's a primary. The primary in Georgia used to be at the end of July, and now it's in May. And so that's a massive change. But there's also name recognition challenges because we have the same first name, so they're not really sure which Stacey they like. And so we're now on television trying to convince them which Stacey they want. I think that they're going to pick me. But the other real difference between myself and my opponent, she and I have differed on gun safety issues. She has voted for legislation that forced law enforcement to put guns back on the streets. I like to say I've only ever gotten D's and F's from the NRA, the only bad grades my parents have ever been proud of. And she and I have disagreed on public education. She supported legislation more than once that undermined public education and that allowed private interests to have too much say in how our schools could have been run. Luckily, we were able to beat some of it, not all of it. And I see myself as the strongest advocate for public education, and those are the two places where we really differ.
Hi, Sarah. I was curious, how do you see your run for governor playing a role in this blue wave that we're seeing of people winning elections that it wasn't expected, especially running in Georgia, where no one,
It's okay, you can say it.
hasn't won.
It's okay. It's okay, you can say it. No one thinks it's going to happen. It's okay.
No,
I believe.
no, I want it to happen
I am teasing
so
you.
much.
Tell me your name.
Amanda.
Amanda, I am just teasing you. No, here's the thing. My election, winning the primary, but more importantly, winning the general, is absolutely part of the blue wave. But the way we talk about it is that we are building the blue wave. Our responsibility is not to wait for a wave to sweep over us, but to actually, compose it. And that's why we are investing in on-the-ground work. That's why we have folks who are texting and phone banking and canvassing. And we've already reached out to more than 1 million voters, which is unheard of in a primary. And we're doing that because we have to Nancy's question, we have to build the infrastructure to win. Because a wave doesn't just happen. It has to be composed, it has to be constructed, it has to be pushed along. And in the Deep South, where there is a lot of skepticism about its capacity, my victory is going to transform the way we talk about politics.
Switching gears here, I'm just kind of curious, why did you choose to write under a pseudonym?
I'm glad you asked. So I was in law school. I was publishing, actually in the same year I wrote my first romance novel, I also published my treatise on the cognitive dissonance of the operational dissonance of the unrelated business income tax exemption. And the glazing of the eyes that precedes that. Essentially, it was that the advent of Google, and when people look up your name, they find these things to be written. Before I wrote that, my very first published work was on Mesopotamian astronomy that I wrote when I was in high school. It was published in a college journal because I thought for a minute I'd be a physicist anyway. But when I found that, I realized, wait, if somebody looks at my name and they find operational dissonance of business income tax exemption and rules of engagement, they're going to think that it's a romance novel written by Alan Greenspan, and nobody's going to buy it. And so I decided that I needed a more evocative name that sounded more romantic. And I watched, as I mentioned, I watch a lot of television, so I was watching an A&E biography of Elizabeth Montgomery, who played Samantha on Bewitched. And her alter ego on Bewitched was Serena. And I was like, I don't really like my R's, but I like my L's. And so I became Selena Montgomery.
Let's
Yeah.
take one more in the back. We do two.
Sure.
She never
Yeah.
got two.
What
And
are
I'll
the,
go faster.
that's a quick one. What are the other races to watch? Where else should we be focusing our attention? So we're all in on your race, but where else?
Beto O'Rourke in Texas, because Texas is very movable. The governor's race down in Florida, because Democrats lose Florida by 70,000 votes. I'm personally a very big fan of Andrew Gillum. He and I have been friends for years, and that is a winnable race. David Garcia in Arizona is also a really smart candidate. He came close to flipping a statewide seat in Arizona back in 2014, and this is his year to get it. And then I think you guys have a governor's race happening here in New York.
Yes.
Kristen.
But Kristen Sinema out in Arizona is great. I focus on South and Southwest because those are the areas where if we can convert, to go back to Amanda's blue wave question, when we start to flip states that have been consistently red but transforming or transitioning purple for a while, it will only happen because we actually talk to the new people. And that changes America. We have to remember that 2016 did not happen because Donald Trump managed to convince more Americans that he was right. It happened because 77,000 people in 4 states stayed home. And they did not see something to vote for. And I'm not chastising them. I'm chastising those who voted and voted wrong. But those who didn't vote, they had 3 choices. Vote for Hillary, vote for Trump, or don't vote. And it is incumbent upon politicians to give people something to vote for. It is insufficient to say, this person is bad. And I don't think that's what Hillary did, but I think there's structural challenges with how her campaign played out. But our responsibility in 2018 and beyond is that it is not enough to say this guy is bad and this guy is evil. We have to say, here's what happens for you when we work together and you vote for me. And that is why I talk about policies so frequently. People vote when there's something in it for them. It's why all of us vote. For some of us, it's just the maintenance of democracy. For others, it is getting this thing we need. For some others, it's just we want the satisfaction of sticking it to the man, whatever it is. But there has to be a positive reason for voting. And those races, especially in the South and Southwest, I think are transformative for America. And then this has to be a profound question that transforms the way we understand politics and life.
I got it covered. So the issue of education, I know that that's been a hot issue down there. Can you talk a little bit about sort of, Georgia has its challenges in education, public education. Can you talk about what it will take to really transform the public education system in Georgia?
Sure. Public education in Georgia, we are not the worst, but we're nowhere near good at what we need to be doing. Part of the challenge is we fund education based on a formula that was put in place 40 years ago. Georgia doesn't look like that anymore. Georgia is one of the most diverse states in the nation. By 2025, Georgia will be a majority minority state, the first one in the Deep South since Reconstruction. We know it is more expensive to educate a poor child, a child who's rural, a child who has special needs, or a child who speaks English as a second language. And yet our formula does not reflect the necessary investment in those categories. In addition, for the last 16 years, the Republican Party has systematically divested public education of $9 billion. Billion with a B. You cannot build any effective system when you systematically and consistently underserve it. And what that has meant is that we actually had children who graduated from high school at one point in Georgia who, when you added up all the number of furlough days, had missed a solid year of education. And so one is investment. We have to actually invest in education again. Number 2, we have to understand that to invest in education, that means investing in teachers and in students and in the professionals who support them. Bus drivers, cafeteria workers, school counselors, nurses. You have to put technology in school. And you have to treat every school as though it is the most important school. My parents made sure we lived on the poor street, on the middle class side of town, so we get zoned into the good school. You should not have to have a degree in cartography to get a good education. And as governor, my mission is going to be the type of funding that recognizes that you should have arts no matter where you go to school, that you should have STEM education no matter where you go to school, that your zip code should not determine the quality of your education, and that happens in part because we yoke education to property taxes. We tell you from the beginning, we are going to underfund your school because you aren't wealthy enough to live in the right place. My mission is to make certain that zip code is no longer a metric for the quality of the education you receive, and that means investing in it. But that's what we should do. That is our first priority, and that's our first responsibility.
Stacey, once again, thank you so much for your time, for coming here and talking to us, for writing this amazing book that you all have now and should get signed by Stacey, because that'll make it more valuable. Also, so you can ask her maybe more questions. But this is.
Can I say something? I'd love to say something just very quickly to Stacey. I want to thank her.
Hold on.
May I just really, it's important for me to say this. I've lived in France for 15 years and I just moved back to America, and I live in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn right now. And this afternoon I was in my kitchen and I heard you on the radio. And I didn't know anything about you. And I just ducked out of a work event that I had to be at so that I could come and meet you. You had, teary. You had a profound impact. Your words resonated with me deeply. I feel hopeful for the first time in a very long time, and I wanted to say thank you so much for doing what you do.
Thank you. She's the only one who can do that. Not that time. I already told you. It's not that time. But yes, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Stacey. We look forward to supporting your candidacy and watching it. And thank you, Ashley, for your wonderful questions. Thank you, Stacey. And we'll stick around and try to talk.
Absolutely, I'd be honored.
Thank you.